Hello, everyone. Welcome. Thank you for tuning in. My name is Audrey Stewart, and on behalf of Harvard Bookstore, I am so excited to welcome you to today's event with Katie Worth, discussing her new book, Miseducation: How Climate Change is Taught in America. She is joined in conversation today by Bill Keller. Through good times and bad, Harvard Bookstore will continue to bring authors and their work to our virtual community. Our fall season is in full swing and we have the holidays coming up. You don't want to miss out on our events, and make sure to check out our event schedule at harvard.com/events, where you can also sign up for our email newsletter and browse our shelves from home. Today's discussion will conclude with some time for questions. If you have a question at any time during the talk, go to the Q&A on your screen and we'll get through as many as time allows. If you'd like to purchase a copy of Miseducation, there will be a link in the chat where you can purchase. All sales through this link support Harvard Bookstore, so thank you. There will also be a link for donation in the chat if you would like to give additional support to Harvard Bookstore. Without your continued support and patronage, this virtual series wouldn't be possible. You also have the option for closed captioning for this talk. If you would like closed captioning for this event, go click the CC button on your screen. Thank you again for tuning in support of our authors, our incredible booksellers, and our landmark independent bookstore. We sincerely appreciate your support, especially now. And as you may have experienced in virtual gatherings, technical issues may arise. If they do, we'll do our best to resolve them as quickly as we can. Thank you in advance for your patience and understanding. Now, I'm so excited to introduce today's speakers. Katie Worth is an investigative journalist. She joined Frontline in 2015 as the inaugural Frontline Columbia Tow Journalism Fellow, and in 2018 was selected as an O'Brien Fellowship in Public Service Journalism. She co-produced the cinematic interactive story, The Last Generation, which won an Emmy for Outstanding New Approaches in Documentary. Her work has appeared in Scientific American, National Geographic, Slate, and The Best American Science and Nature Writing in 2016. She's joined today by Bill Keller. Bill is a Pulitzer Prize winning journalist, most recently serving as editor-in-chief of the Marshall Project, a nonprofit independent news organization focused on crime and punishment in the United States. He was a New York Times correspondent, editor, and op-ed columnist for 30 years and was executive editor for 8. During that time, the newspaper won 18 Pulitzer Prizes. Today, they're discussing Miseducation. Katie reviewed scores of textbooks, built a 50-state database, and traveled to a dozen communities to talk to children and teachers about what is being taught, and found a red-blue divide in climate education. More than 1/3 of young adults believe that climate change is not man-made, and science instructors are being contradicted by history teachers who tell children not to worry about it. This book, depicting the failings of our school system, has been widely praised. Bill McKibben called it exceptional reporting, and Glenn Branch called it meticulously researched and vividly written. Without further ado, I'll turn things over to our speakers. Katie, Bill, thank you so much for joining us. The virtual stage is yours. I'm so happy to have you all here.
I'm really glad to be here. Thanks for having me.
Thanks, Audrey. Katie, first of all, congratulations on a really terrific book. It's a little unsettling, but it is beautifully written and wonderfully well reported. I think, like a lot of parents, I sort of look to the next generation as the hope for a better country. They'll bring maybe a little more wisdom and passion to issues like this. And the polls generally do show that millennials and younger are more tuned into climate change as an issue, more willing to make fairly aggressive policy steps to deal with it. But I learned from your book that that's no thanks to our education system. So talk a little bit about what you found in the classroom.
Well, what I found was a real diversity in terms of what is taught. As you know, there is not a there's not, a unified federal education system or curriculum. It's every state is empowered to decide what kids in their state are taught. And so as a result, there's sort of this rough red-blue divide over what kids learn that you can kind of like like make an educated guess about what a kid may be learning in school about climate change, which is a phenomenon that will affect all of their lives, no matter where they live, by knowing what political party runs their state legislature, right? So what that means is that kind of the facts about the future and about what may lie ahead in this century that will be defined by climate change becomes the purview of kids who happen to live in a state that is teaching the truth about this issue and that is run by one particular party, right? And that becomes kind of an equity issue. So yeah, like broadly speaking, some kids are getting pretty robust education about climate change, and other kids may literally never hear the words climate change on school grounds.
How much are the teachers to blame for this?
It's hard to blame teachers. The truth is that a lot of teachers didn't learn it themselves. So they're not necessarily operating from a position of strength. And they also, teachers are very overburdened, right? So like, teachers told me they barely have time in the day to pee. So, so to ask them to then take on this whole new subject, to become expert in it enough to teach it is a lot to ask. That said, there's teachers all over the country, I would say in every community, that are, no matter what the state requirements are, they're finding ways to integrate this into their curriculum and teach students the science and the civics of this issue. And that happens no matter what the politics of the community are. So yeah, there's the teachers, I talked to some teachers who are very ideologically driven in this issue and who are teaching their kids that climate change may be, it is natural, or that it's a hoax. But I would say that most actually, I can tell you exactly. We know that about 1/3 of teachers tell kids that many scientists agree that climate change many scientists believe that climate change is natural. So that's 1/3 of teachers that are saying that false statement to their students.
Where does that notion come from?
Well, it didn't appear out of the ether on accident. It's misinformation that was spread pretty intentionally by the fossil fuel industry and their allies over the course of many decades. We know quite a lot about this because of some great investigative reporting by the New York Times and by many others, the Los Angeles Times, Inside Climate News. We know that even while fossil fuel companies own scientists, were saying climate change is happening, it's because of humans, we need to prepare for it. And even while they were preparing for it with their own infrastructure, like strengthening their oil derricks and so on to prepare for extreme weather, they were spreading this message that, oh, we just don't know, that science isn't settled, it's all this hoax. They were sending that message, spending millions and millions a year to spread that message for a couple decades, and that took hold. It took hold. And the reason that they did that is, of course, that there's a lot of money at stake. If we leave fossil fuels underground, that will cost the industry trillions and trillions of dollars.
One of the points you make that I think is really important is that in order to combat to suppress the truth about climate change, you don't have to disprove it, you just have to sow doubt. And it's in the nature of science to criticize itself, always looking to move the ball a little bit farther down, ball of knowledge a little farther down. Talk about that.
Yeah, it's
You have
strategy that
used
was
the phrase doubt mongering, which I loved.
right. It's a strategy that was kind of created and perfected by the tobacco industry. And we know a lot about that because there were later lawsuits against the tobacco industry, and they had to turn over a lot of documents as part of discovery. And there's a really terrific and shocking book called The Merchants of Doubt by Naomi Oreskes and Eric M. Conway that really goes deep into what exactly happened with the tobacco industry. And what they realized is you don't need the whole country to question whether cigarettes are causing cancer. You just need a portion, because that doubt, just with enough doubt, it's really hard to justify major changes. It's hard to justify regulation if you don't know for sure that it's necessary, right? Because there's a lot of, like, people don't want to quit smoking if they don't have to. And so so just like that portion of doubt, that like dose of doubt is enough to inoculate against regulation. And so then that strategy has been taken up and used by many industries since then. Pesticides industry has done it. It was, like the defense industrial complex did it over nuclear weapons, and they do this by hiring scientists to go on TV and to, say like, oh, the science is still in doubt. And that then, spreads the doubt far enough that it stops action.
Are journalists to some extent complicit in this because of our tendency to tell both sides of the story, even if there really aren't two sides or two equivalent sides?
Yeah, absolutely. There's a lot of evidence that all major media through the 90s and early 2000s was buying this story that it was undecided. And in some like compulsion that comes out of an idea that we should be fair, like always quoted both sides, even though there was no truth to one of those sides, right? There, even at the time, the evidence was absolutely overwhelming that humans were causing the planet to warm by pumping millions of tons of warming pollutants, atmosphere warming pollutants into the air every single day, and that was adding up, and eventually it would cause these major changes. 90 at the time, 97% of climate scientists were in agreement. Today, the agreement is even stronger. There was a study that looked at every peer-reviewed research study, published study in 2019 that address the question of what was causing climate change, and it was thousands of them. Every single one of them said it was human. So there was not a single paper that they could find that proposed any evidence of any cause other than humans, right? So we're basically at 100% consensus now. But journalists, in this, misguided attempt to quote be fair, were part of the problem of spreading this doubt. They were quoting both sides, even though one side was very much backed by moneyed interests and did not have scientific support.
Eddie, why is this a partisan issue? I mean, it seems a little simple-minded to say, well, the Republicans are in the pocket of the fossil fuels industry and the Democrats aren't. Is there an ideological component to it? Or is it just that nowadays everything is a partisan issue?
I'm probably not the right person to answer that. What I do know is that there's a lot of conservatives who are concerned about climate change today. Like the data shows that even people who are Republican, a majority believe that know that humans are causing climate change, and somehow that can and are worried about it, right? And yet, I mean, and it doesn't take a genius, to realize this at this point. At this point, climate change is not some like hypothetical futuristic thing. It's happening all the time, all around us. So if you're connected to your community at all, your land at all, then you see it. You're seeing it, that things are different than they were when you were a kid. And so like this is not lost on people all across the country. And yet that concern has not really filtered up to the highest echelon of within that party. And it's still very much entrenched. This like denialist perspective is very much entrenched, probably because the solutions to this problem involve, some pretty serious regulation, which, small government Republicans tend to compulsively, just like on first glance, be against. And also because it will very much affect a major pillar of that that's under that big tent of the Republican Party, the oil industry.
Got it. Talk a little bit about the role of the textbook publishers in this whole thing. I mean, it sounds from what you've reported that like Texas is the tail that wags that dog. Why is Texas determining what goes into our science textbooks as opposed to California or New York, one of the more blue states, more progressive on the subject?
So the history is that back in the late 19th century, Texas and many other southern states decided to have statewide textbook adoption. So in other places, it had always been left up, or across the country, schools and districts decided which textbooks they would buy. And then there was this shift where these states were doing statewide adoption, and that purchasing power allowed them to have more control over what was in the textbooks. Part of it was because these textbook companies were kind of corrupt, but part of it was very political. They were at the time, as we still are, arguing how the Civil War would be presented to children. So this gave Texas a huge amount of sway over textbooks, because at the time it was the largest textbook purchaser in the nation. So these publishers would pay really close attention to what was happening in the state board of education, what their politics were, what they might want to see and not see, what they were saying in their meetings about state standard, about academic standards, and about the textbooks. And then they would draft their textbooks specifically to kind of cater to those political whims. And then those textbooks then would be sold across the country, right? So it had ramifications far beyond the state borders. And that's still true today. It still has a great deal of influence on education across the country.
I still kind of wonder why California doesn't have more clout. I mean, California, for example, has a lot to do with automobiles, gas consumption standards, and other things. They tend to be the leading edge of the blue states.
The answer to that is that it does have California does have an impact. And so what we see now is that there's actually two separate textbook products that are created. And even if they're by the same authors and published by the same publishing company, they'll like reword things. And so, there's a ton of, actually, New York Times did a really cool side-by-side comparison of the same exact textbooks, one for the California version and one for the Texas version, on a whole bunch of issues. So like how they talk about immigration, how they talk about slavery, and they use very different language that is very clearly partisan, like influenced by partisan politics. And so what we're seeing with climate change is that there's these two tiers of textbooks, and some of them are very explicit and speak very robustly about climate change and unapologetically. And then others have just lots of kind of doubtful language. Like, and I read through dozens of these textbooks. You know, one of the ones that I looked deeply at said that climate, you know, like while many scientists believe humans are causing climate change, some propose that it's natural, which wasn't true when it was written. It's still not. Another one said climate change could have some positive effects and some less positive effects. And so all the effects would be positive, but like some would be just less positive. And then there's a lot of like just kind of irresolute language, like carbon dioxide is suspected of contributing to global warming. But you know, when it comes to natural climate change, they don't say volcanoes are suspected of causing you know, changing the climate. They just say volcanoes change the climate when they spew ash into the air, you know, even though it's like the exact same principles that they're considering in both cases, the exact same theories, the same data. They're using it both in both cases. And in one, they use this doubtful language, and in the other, they're just authoritative.
Mhm. I know education is famously not something that's run from Washington, D.C., but every state has its own standards, and some school boards have their own subsets of standards. But does the election of a progressive husband of a school teacher in Joe Biden hold out any promise of making climate change a more salient part of our kids' science education?
That's a good question. It's hard. So you're right that the feds don't. There's they don't have a lot of power over education, and when they try to exert power, it doesn't always go well. Like if you might remember the Common Core battles, that was kind of a federal initiative that then went very south as soon as it hit states. And so, you know, I think the federal government is really like hesitant to get involved. But that said, you know, a lot of agencies have started creating a lot of educational materials. The NOAA and NASA both have materials for teachers. They have trainings for teachers. They have funding for schools that do various programs. So there are ways to kind of get at it in like a roundabout way, but not in the, I can't imagine there being kind of a top down like mandate, like thou shalt teach climate change in your schools. Like that would not fly.
Mm-hmm. Before we went live, you said you've been following a dispute in Texas that's relevant to your book. What's that about?
Yeah, I'm actually here in Dallas right as we speak. But yeah, so the Texas has always avoided mentioning climate change in their state academic standards. And academic standards are just so interesting, even though they're very arcane, because they really represent like the best chance a state has to shape what their kids learn. So a state standard might be like, oh, in like 5th grade, you're going to learn about cells, you know, like they kind of determine what by age and by group or by subject a kid might learn. And so the science standards in Texas have never mentioned climate change unless you take like an advanced earth science or environmental science class. Well, that's changing. So the last year they included some mention of it in high school science classes. And this right now, as we speak, literally like a meeting is happening right now about whether to include it in middle school science standards. And again, as we were just talking about, this is something that's like being very carefully watched by the nation's textbook publishers, because whatever is in Texas state standards will wind up in the next generation. They want to know, because then they're going to be building their next textbooks around these standards. So it has this bigger impact than just Texas schools. And so they were proposed to be included, but then they've been very much watered down, well, at least somewhat watered down over the course of several meetings now. So like, you know, at one point students would be instructed to, consider how human activities over the last 150 years have influenced the climate, and that's now, I don't have it right in front of me, but it's something like, examine how humans can influence the climate, which is still, much better than nothing, but that you can tell that it's not as specific, as saying, there's been this huge battle over whether the word can should be in there, like humans can influence the climate, as opposed to just humans influence the climate, which we know to be true. And that subtle language is the subject of a lot of debate. And the people involved in this, the Texas, there's a group called the Texas Energy Council, an industry association that a lot of Texas energy companies are part of. They've been very, very involved in this battle. They have volunteers that have sat in on the board meetings, have testified, who have helped to write amendments to the standards, and they have been very clear and very public in their opposition to a really robust education about climate change in Texas.
Has it risen up to the level of statewide politics, or is it more localized?
Well, yeah, it's the State Board of Education that's currently considering it, and that board is elected. It's elected, and so it's just I think there's 15 districts in Texas. Each one elects a representative that sits on this council, and then this State Board of Education meets quarterly, makes these decisions, and then they play out across the state, and then have this wider influence. So it is what is decided is not just a local issue, it's a statewide issue, and then will have influence beyond Texas.
Mhm. One of the things that I particularly liked about your book was that, we're talking about policy and science and wonkery, and you present all that in a clear and understandable way, but you put a human face on it, a lot of human faces. One of your techniques is to segue back and forth between two places that are relevant: Chico, your hometown or your birth town, I guess, in California, and of all places, the Marshall Islands, way out in the Pacific, somewhere beyond Hawaii. Talk about the difference, what you were trying to get at with those two locations.
Well, this book's origin story is was in the Marshall Islands of all places. So I was a reporter for Frontline for many years, and a colleague and I were assigned to do a story about climate change in the Marshall Islands, which is right in the middle of the Pacific. It's fairly remote. It's kind of equidistant from Japan and Hawaii and Australia, right in the middle of the ocean, and it's famously very low lying. So these islands, their highest point often is under 20 feet elevation. So just a few inches or a few feet of sea level rise could really endanger the entire nation. And big storms with big waves that are happening more and more, they'll wash over the entire island sometimes. So all that to say, it's a place that's kind of famously endangered by climate change. And we went there and we started talking to kids there about their future. And we were really surprised and, just shocked by how and impressed with how much the kids knew about climate change, even at a really young age. They could talk about the causes, they could talk about the effects, they could talk about what it might mean for their future, which is more than a lot of adults that I know here. So one of the kids that I talked to is this 9-year-old Iserman who You know, his family was thinking about moving to Enid, Oklahoma, where they had some extended family. And so the question came up like, okay, well, if Eiserman moves to Enid, Oklahoma, you know, this kid who can speak like at length about climate change because he learned it every single year in school from the time he was 6. And what would he learn about climate change in Oklahoma? So I went to Oklahoma, and the answer at the time was probably nothing. So I talked to 5 Marshallese kids that went to Enid High School, and of them, 4 had never heard an adult say the words climate change on school grounds until I did. So like it was just very absent from their education. And these were kids whose families had immigrated from the Marshall Islands. So that was one kind of point of entry to this story. And I just got really interested, like, what does the picture of climate education look like in America? And while I was kind of just starting this research, a mega fire occurred in Paradise, California, and burnt that town and the surrounding towns to the ground. 90% of the buildings there were destroyed, including a lot of the school buildings. So I kind of was this climate reporter that found herself reporting on her own hometown, you know, because all of those people from Paradise flooded into Chico, which is where I grew up and where my family still lives. So I went there and I wound up sitting in on a 7th grade science class of kids who had been displaced from Paradise. Their whole school had been displaced. It had taken up residence in this shuttered big box hardware store in Chico because that was the only real estate available. It was like this very surreal and kind of apocalyptic scene. Like these kids were learning in the aisles and using the shelves like as desks, and they were like, you know, eating lunch at the checkout counters. And it just was like this very surreal scene. And this 7th grade science teacher, every single year, he taught a unit on climate change. And that year he taught a unit on climate change to these kids who could arguably be described as climate refugees. And it was just really emotional to witness, especially because a lot of the kids, if you know, they knew anything about climate change, they'd been told it was a hoax. And you know, to watch him navigate that like layered situation where he's kind of like letting the kids know, like, hey, this is happening and it's happened to you, and the kids pushing back on that, like, well, no, my parents say it's not real. It was just really gutting.
Aside from the Marshall Islands, are there places where the schools get it right?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's places, so there's kind of a movement to include climate change, not just in science classes, but also in like civics classes and in government classes, other places where where it's relevant, because it's relevant in all kinds, to basically every industry right now is influenced in some way or will need to evolve because of climate change. So, you know, there's some states that have started adopting science standards that are, you know, much more like a kid will become somewhat climate literate somewhere in their education. So for example, Hawaii, at the same time that I went to Oklahoma, and at that time it wasn't included in any required class, I went to I was looking at the standards in Hawaii, and at that time the Hawaii standard, I'll read it to you. They would learn first about climate change in 3rd grade social studies, middle school science, high school biology, US history and government, Pacific Island studies, earth science, environmental science, and at least one math class. Similarly broad academic standards have been adopted in New Jersey, and there's kind of a movement to do that in other states as well.
Right. I'm going to check into the Q&A box and see if any of our virtual neighbors have questions for you. Here's one. Do you think the climate change denial by conservative lawmakers is based in their own miseducation, or do they simply choose not to care?
Well, I think probably some of both. Like there's really a motivation. There are people who know better and who nonetheless spread misinformation, but I think it's probably more common for people to just really just dismiss the science and say, oh, well, that's not real. And then fight against regulation, and just like kind of not just kind of like choose not to think about it too much. And so I think that's probably the case. Like there's in my book, I decided to call organizations that push misinformation climate denialists, but like the average person who's just like trusting the information that they're getting in the world and the information is bad about this issue, I wouldn't call them denialists, because I don't think that there's like ill intent there. I think it's just truly having bad access to bad information in your media diet, and I would call those more skeptics, climate skeptics. But yeah, I mean, certainly there are plenty of people who either know better or should know better based on their position and their area of expertise, that nonetheless spread climate misinformation.
Are you conscious of any sort of overlap with the anti-vaxxer movement?
Yeah, it's so interesting. I think there is this sense that there's this broader anti-science sentiment that is taking root in a certain part of America, the American like ideological landscape. And so one thing that that really struck me and surprised me is that if you look at the numbers of who trusts climate, so who trusts science? Science is a very trusted institution in America, and it has not, the percentage of Americans who trust science has not changed over the years very much. But then if you drill down in that, what you find is there used to be people of all religions, pretty much, and all across the political spectrum, just roughly trusted science more or less about the same. But lately, in recent years, people who identify as Democrats, they tend to trust science more, and those who identify as Republicans tend to trust science less. And that's true for evangelical Christians trust science less than they used to, and less than people who are of other religions. So it's like the divide is visible in when you drill down into like who trusts science. And then once you plant this seed that like you can't trust scientists, then anything that comes along that you don't want to believe, you can just dismiss, like, oh, well, science is not to be trusted anyway.
Is America an outlier in terms of how it presents climate change information to its students compared to the other, say, developed Western countries?
Yeah, yes. So there's actually a study by a survey by the United Nations that came out earlier this year that looked at that exact question and looked at kind of people's belief and concern about climate change in countries all over the country. And the US had, and also across generations. And what they found was American kids ages 14 to 17 disbelieved or like rejected the idea of a climate crisis at a higher rate than kids in any other nation in Europe or in North America. And so, yeah, I mean, it's not, and that's not an accident. Like there's been a really intentional push to spread this like doubt message in America that's got, millions and millions of dollars a year was being pumped into that for a long time. And like there was this another part of the origin of this book was I was at a denialist conference. So there's like think tanks that get together every single year that are all denialists, and I was at one of these, and the leader of one of these think tanks told me, oh yeah, we're about to send this packet to every science teacher in the country. The packet included a book called Why Scientists Disagree About Climate Change, and also a DVD that was about solar cycles. So it was very explicitly denial materials, and they sent it out. I don't know that they sent it out to every science teacher in America, but they did to at least a couple 100,000 science teachers in America. And I would guess that the vast majority probably just threw it in the trash, but some of them didn't. Some of them probably looked at it and said, oh yeah, great. I've been wanting, I can use this in my classroom. So, that's happening in America, and it's not happening in other countries. So yes, the answer is yes, it's an outlier.
You say at one point in your book that I'm paraphrasing, that the denialists are entitled to declare victory, that they basically won the battle.
Yeah.
That you really feel that downbeat about the prospects of changing things?
Well, that okay, well, I'll answer that in multiple parts. So that chapter refers back to this memo that was written in 1998 and was then leaked soon after to the New York Times. The memo was from a meeting hosted by the American Petroleum Institute and attended by the Exxon, several other major fossil fuel companies. And it was the whole point of the meeting was, how can we communicate doubt about climate change to the American public? And they created this whole communications plan with lots of tactics and strategies laid out. And it said, victory will be achieved when the public understands, in quotes, the uncertainties in climate science. And one of the tactics that they discussed was reaching out to kids and partnering with the the National Science Teachers Association, which they did, and creating curricular materials and spreading it around, sending it to teachers, which they did. And they said that this was necessary because in order to, quote, erect a barrier, end quote, against future regulations. So, all of that to say, they said they defined victory as the public understanding, quote, the uncertainties in climate science. And, a big questioning the certainty of climate science is now a fundamental belief of of one of the two political parties in this country, right? So you can say that by that definition, it's been achieved. It's been achieved. Victory has been achieved. That said, there's, it won't last forever. There was a long time in this country where people did debate whether cigarettes cause cancer, but today you don't argue. There's no argument. Nobody is making that case anymore. And at some point, there's going to be this inflection point where, you can just no longer, with a straight face, say that humans aren't causing climate change. Like, it's just going to be too apparent and too abundantly obvious. And the question is that moment going to come soon enough for society to then take action to forestall the worst outcomes of this crisis, right? And that is something that we can debate. And on days where I feel more hopeful, I think, yeah, like there's reason for hope. And then in other days, it feels pretty dire.
Let me dip into the inbox again.
I'm curious if you have any hope.
I'm an optimist by nature. But I think we're going to do a lot more damage to the planet and the people who live on it before we hit that inflection point you talked about.
Yeah.
This is an unusual question from an anonymous attendee. Any stories or research that you did for this book but didn't have room to make it into the final draft that you'd like to share with us today?
Well, one thing that I think about a lot was this interaction that I had with a kid in Idaho. I visited this class in some super small town. I think it was Cascade in Idaho, and I watched their class do this unit on climate change, and afterwards I was talking to kids, and this one kid was like, "Well, I don't believe it because my parents don't believe it." And I said, like, and I was, he said that they joked about it a lot and they always were watching TV shows that made fun of it. And it was just not true. This is a 13-year-old kid. And I was like, well, like, do you think it's possible that your parents are wrong? And he's like, oh, yeah, totally. But they're my parents. And so I'm going to just believe what they believe. And so it was almost like he was too young to have that defense of like, no, we believe this because it's right. He was willing to acknowledge, he was able to acknowledge that they may be wrong, but still they were the most important people in his life. And so he was going to be on their side. It was like this sense of like, this is what my people believe. And so whether it's right or not, I'm with them, and that sort of like encapsulates this problem to me, that it's like, it's not about what the science says. It's about like this ideology that people buy into, and like to crack through that, like to kind of convince, like, even though your parents are wrong, and so you should think otherwise on this issue. It's like it's a big lift, it's a big ask of kids.
There's sowing family discord.
Yeah.
Here's a question from a professor, I gather. I heard your WBGH discussion on Monday and ordered your book. It's arriving today. I'm looking forward to diving in just as soon as it does. I want to ask what, if anything, institutions of higher education could do in this space, as certainly when it comes to graduate education, what is studied and discussed is very clear about the processes that are enabling these climate disruptions. Thank you for your work and clarity, and I look forward to having my students read your work in spring in the Sustainable Water Management program at Tufts.
Wow, that's so cool. That's so great to hear, and I'll be really interested to hear what you think of the book. I do think I've thought about this when it comes to higher education in terms of training teachers about how to handle this issue. I think, the data says that some teachers just avoid this question because they know there's going to be tension over it. Like, and truly every single classroom that I was in across the country, no matter what kind of community there was some tension over this issue, like whether it was like students pushing back against teachers running into conflicts with other teachers or with parents. It's like an issue that people have big feelings about. So helping, in teachers, like when teachers are getting trained to teach these questions, what are they learning? Can we give them some kind of education about how to navigate these issues with their students and with their communities? I think that could be a really powerful intervention. And yeah, like, I think I would love to hear what this participant thinks about other areas of of higher ed that could get involved. I do know, I was sitting in this Arkansas classroom when in walked a representative of the fossil fuel industry. She had this PowerPoint for the 7th graders that was all about how the fossil fuel industry was really important for the state, and kind of some of the geology. And then she also then told kids kind of inaccurately that like they don't have anything to worry about when it came to climate change. And so it has made me think of like, who else is getting into these classrooms, and like, what are they telling kids, and is there a way to get other kinds of experts in to give like a more full perspective. We know that the oil industry is very focused on getting their message to kids. So are there other people in other industries or in academia that are equally focused?
There's one from another fan. I listened to you on another event. You mentioned 8 words to remember about climate change and kids. The last word was hope. Can you speak to this?
Yeah. So this is
8 words.
the 8 words. If the kid walks away from their education knowing that it's real, it's us, it's bad, but there's hope, those are the 8 words, then they're better off than a lot of their elders. And that last point is really it's really important not to forget, because these kids can, if you just give kids all the doom and gloom, that's not actually helping prepare them for the future. They need to know that there's solutions. They need to know that they can be part of it. We need them to be part of it. We need them to kind of roll up their sleeves and get to work on this issue if that's their calling, if that's what they want to do, or at minimum be able to participate in civic discourse about it with some information. So yeah, that hope is really an essential aspect. And actually that's what, when I logged in, that was what they were discussing at the Texas State Board of Education. There had been a proposal to include a like a line in the standards that said, how, like, discuss ways that climate change could be mitigated. And several of the more conservative board members were pushing back against that, had stricken that actually from the standards, and had replaced it with something like describe the pros and cons of sources of energy, which is not the same. And so the argument is that the people who wanted that mitigation element in is, they were saying, like, kids just describing the phenomenon is not going to really prepare kids. And like, these kids want to hold on to some hope, and they want to know what the adults are doing about this problem, and that including that in the standards is important. So that is like kind of this, source of contention in education.
Right. Here's a question to both of us. How can journalists do better in covering climate issues? Should the notion of including both sides of a story or issue be retired entirely? If not, how might it be applied story by story?
Yeah, I think journalists, I'd love to hear what you have to say about this.
Well, I don't think we should retire entirely the idea of telling sides, but we should be skeptical of the arguments on both sides, and where the skepticism is justified, behave accordingly. I think, I tend to read pretty mainstream stuff. I read the New York Times, Washington Post, Wall Street Journal, sometimes a bunch of magazines. And I think those publications are well past the sort of moral equivalency, the fake both sides argument. And that's good. You don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater, but that bathwater is way past its prime.
Yeah, I completely agree. And I mean, this applies to other issues too, that like ultimately what we need to find out what the truth is. And if somebody is spreading messages that's not the truth, we don't have the obligation to include that just because they represent, because they say it, right? And so, like, this is coming up with the critical race theory issue that's being debated. That's the educational issue of the day, and so when people say, well, teachers are teaching climate, these liberal educators are teaching critical race theory in our schools, the journalist doesn't just parrot that, but actually like checks, is that happening? Like, is that the truth? And in what ways is it the truth? Like digs a little bit deeper. And so, yes, I think that just blindly parroting what quote both sides say should be retired, but but like obviously listening to all sides deeply, trying to find the truth, and having that skepticism that Bill talks about that's where you get good journalism from.
The fact that you're in Texas paying attention to an educational standards meeting suggests that you're not done with this subject. What are you doing next?
Yeah, good question. In some ways I'd like to be done with this subject because it's far past my attention span, beyond my attention. You know, I've spent so many years on this, but having spent so many years on it, like when something like this happens, I of course feel like, well, I want to know what's happening, and what I want to tell the world what's happening, because I probably know more about climate change than most people on the planet, climate education than most people on the planet. And, you know, I also want to be doing some reporting in my own hometown more, you know, like these climate catastrophes have long tails, right? It doesn't just come and go. They have long-term effects, and I'd like to do a little bit more reporting on what that looks like on the ground.
Okay. So are you going to write specifically about this Texas dispute, or are you just gathering?
Yeah, I'm hoping to. I'm paying a lot of attention to it, and I am hoping to write about it, but I have not quite found I haven't found a home for that, or I don't know what exactly the future of the story is, but it seems worth paying attention to.
Okay. And are you welcome at the Chico schools?
Yeah, they've been very kind to me, and I'm very well connected in Chico, so they seem to be happy to have me there. Is that what you were asking?
Yeah. You haven't overstayed your welcome in Chico.
Not yet, but that could happen.
Okay. I'm out of questions, and we're just about out of time. Let me check the inbox to see if I've overlooked anybody. Well, there are two remaining questions, and they're both basically the same thing, which is, what the hell do we do to fix this problem? The reverse the trend.
Yeah, I mean, that's a fair question. I think that one thing, there's a bunch of ways to tackle this. What I hear from educators is, first of all, they want to have better resources about how to address this, and so training programs can be powerful. These efforts to get climate change into the standards and into many places in the standards, that can also change. I think, like, as reporters, I think we often think about these top down, like, can Biden do something? But actually what is often most powerful is bottom up approaches, like activism in your community, figure out what's happening in your town schools, and organize around it. I mean, and that's what that's what's happened around a lot of these issues. That's why the creationists were so powerful for so long, is they had a lot of people on the ground that were going to school board meetings, speaking up. And, if people on all sides of all issues were doing that, then there would be the picture in America would be different, I would say.
It does seem to be a pretty significant young cadre of activists working the climate change awareness issue and getting some attention.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it's an issue that young people care a lot about. I don't mean to minimize that by talking about about the ones that don't believe it, right? But because they are young people, have been like the moral and organizing force of recent climate protests. And when they do find out about this issue, they care about it because they have the most at stake. It's reasonable for them to care about it. But it stands that lots of them are just not getting the right information about it.
Yeah. To quote Crosby, Stills, Nash and Young, children teach your parents well. We're officially out of time. I don't know what Audrey, is this over to you?
Over to me. We are out of time, but thank you both for being here. This has been a fantastic conversation. Katie, Bill, we're really, really grateful to have you here and to have you give this fantastic talk. And to everyone who is showing up and watching today, thank you for tuning in and showing up for authors, publishers, indie book selling, and the incredible staff at Harvard Bookstore. Please check out the link in the chat if you would like to purchase a copy of Miseducation. You won't regret it. It's really important. Thank you so much for being here again. Have a great holiday season and we'll see you soon. Have a great rest of your day, everybody. Take care.
Bye-bye.
Bye.